In this episode of Bartending Pro, we're going to learn all about whiskey, Scotch, bourbon. Hey, welcome back. In this next part of the What's in the Bottle series, we're going to learn about whiskey. So I got my little iPad here, make sure I get all this right. So what is whiskey? Whiskey is an alcoholic beverage distilled largely from fermented grain mash. And different grains are used for different varietals, including barley, malted barley, rye, malted rye, wheat, and corn. And typically, whiskey is aged in wooden barrels that are charred oak. Now, malt whiskey is made primarily from malted barley, which just means the barley grains have been germinated, so the little sprout is starting to come out, and they use that in the fermentation process. Which, by the way, if you haven't watched the movie on fermentation and alcohol creation, make sure you go check that out. And compared to malt whiskey, grain whiskey is just made from any type of grain. Now, single malt whiskey is basically just made from a single batch or a single distillery that uses one type of malted grain. Now, in most cases, single malts bear the name of the distillery with an age statement and perhaps some indication of some special treatments such as maturation in a port wine cask. Those big barrels that they use to age wine in, they'll take those and they'll use those for the aging the whiskey, which gives them unique characteristics. Now, a blended malt whiskey is a mixture of single malt whiskeys from different distilleries, and if a whiskey is labeled pure malt or just malt, it's almost always a blend of malt whiskey. And this used to be called vatted malt or a vatted whiskey. Now, blended whiskeys are typically made from a mixture of malt and grain whiskeys, often along with just general neutral spirits, which just means kind of a generic ethanol alcohol. A blend typically contains whiskey from many distilleries so that the blender can produce a flavor consistent with the brand. So to kind of get into more of the nuts and bolts of the ratios of things, malt whiskey is made from mash that consists of at least 51% malted barley. Rye whiskey is made from mash that consists of at least 51% rye. Wheat whiskey, at least 51% wheat. So it's basically kind of that more than 50%, right? That 51% tipping point for most of these. Corn whiskey deviates a little bit because corn whiskey is made of at least 80% corn. And then, of course, famous Tennessee whiskey, of which Jack Daniels, George Dickel, Collier & McKeel, Jailers, Benjamin Pritchard's are pretty much the only brands currently bottled. The Tennessee whiskey is the same as bourbon whiskey, as Tennessee whiskey is classified as bourbon under NAFTA. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what is bourbon. Bourbon is a barrel aged, made from a mash that contains at least 51% corn. So it's a corn whiskey, and its name, bourbon, is associated with the area around what is today Bourbon, Kentucky. Now, Scotch is a malt whiskey or grain whiskey made in Scotland. All Scotch whiskey was originally made from malt barley, but commercial distilleries began introducing whiskey made from wheat and rye in the late 18th century. Now, Scotch whiskey is divided into 5 distinct categories: single malt, single grain, blended malt, blended grain, and blended Scotch whiskey. So the different distinctions for Scotch must be aged in oak barrels for at least 3 years, and sometimes the Scotches will be blends, but the age on the bottle has to reflect the youngest whiskey used in that blend. So like if they have a Scotch that's got a 5, a 6, and an 8 year in the batch, they can't call it an 8 year, they have to call it a 5 year. Does that make sense? So when they're blended, the youngest whiskey is what gives the age distinction on the bottle. So of all the different styles of the Scotch whiskey, single malt means a Scotch whiskey produced from only water and malted barley at a single distillery. Single grain Scotch whiskey means a Scotch whiskey distilled at a single distillery, but in addition to water and malted barley, may involve whole grains or other malted or unmalted cereals, and making a single grain requires using a mixture of grains, as barley is a type of grain and some malted barley must be used in all Scotch whiskey. Blended malt Scotch whiskey means the blend of 2 or more single malt Scotch whiskeys from different distilleries. Blended grain Scotch whiskey means a blend of 2 or more single grain Scotch whiskeys from different distilleries. And blended Scotch whiskey means a blend of 1 or more single malt Scotch whiskeys with 1 or more single grain Scotch whiskeys. And then, of course, there's Irish whiskey, which is obviously made in Ireland. Now, Irish whiskey, the contained spirits must be distilled to an alcohol by volume of less than 94.8%. See if I can do that math right. 189.6 proof from a yeast fermented mash of cereal grains. No other distinction with Irish whiskey, it needs to be aged for 3 years in wooden casks. Then there's also what's called a single pot still, which they just use a single still. Usually those are anywhere from 12 to 15 years aged. And then they'll make a single grain, which is different from the single malt because it's not a malted grain, called green ore at 8, 10, 15, 18 years of age. Now, most Irish pot still whiskey is distilled 3 times, while most but not all Scotch whiskey is distilled twice. Peat is rarely used in the malting process, so that Irish whiskey has a smoother finish as opposed to the smoky, earthy overtones common to some Scotches. Whew. So there you go, a lot of information about whiskey. Now, I understand this is a very crafty and particular area of alcohol production and consumption world. So if I got something a little bit off, if you're an expert in this and you have some further insight, then please feel free to share it with everybody. And remember that no, you do not need to know this information to be a bartender. It's just kind of fun stuff if you're really into whiskeys, or maybe you just want a little more information about the history of what you may be drinking on a regular basis. Okay, so thank you for watching. I'm Jason. This has been making you a bartending pro. Make sure you subscribe to get notifications, and I'll see you next time. Take care. For more kick-ass videos, check out these playlists. And subscribe to get new videos. Bartending Pro out!